How did a city once portrayed as the ironclad heart of a police state reach a point where fear quietly replaced order? In the winter of early 2026, Moscow still projected power through high Kremlin walls, ceremonial parades, and carefully staged state broadcasts. Yet behind that facade, something far more destabilizing was unfolding. Crime statistics climbed, emergency calls went unanswered, and entire neighborhoods learned that the presence of authority was no longer guaranteed. This was not a sudden collapse triggered by a single event, but the cumulative result of decisions made over years of war, economic strain, and institutional neglect. The question confronting analysts was simple but unsettling. Had Russia's internal security system already crossed a point of no return? What makes this moment especially striking is the contrast between image and reality. State media continued to emphasize stability, military resilience, and strategic depth, while ordinary citizens encountered empty police stations and delayed responses to violent crime. Western security experts noted that this gap between narrative and lived experience is often the earliest indicator of systemic breakdown. According to recent reporting by major English-language outlets, the Kremlin's focus since the escalation of the Ukraine war shifted decisively outward, prioritizing military production, frontline manpower, and regime security over day-to-day public safety. As resources were redirected, domestic law enforcement quietly became collateral damage. A key element of this erosion was manpower. By late 2025, independent Russian and international observers were already documenting a massive shortfall in police staffing across the country. Analysts compared the situation to late Soviet-era fatigue, when institutions still existed on paper, but lacked the personnel and morale to function effectively. In Moscow itself, districts that once symbolized total surveillance now struggled to maintain basic patrols. For residents, the absence was tangible. Longer response times, reduced investigations, and a growing sense that reporting crime no longer led to protection. This internal vacuum coincided with broader pressures created by the war in Ukraine. As Donald Trump, now serving again as President of the United States, signaled continued Western support for Kyiv, including intelligence sharing and energy sector targeting, Russia faced mounting economic stress. Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, widely reported by Reuters and the BBC, forced Moscow to divert funds toward repairs, air defense, and compensation. Every ruble spent stabilizing refineries or power grids was a ruble not spent on salaries for police officers or investments in domestic security. NATO analysts openly describe this as a classic case of strategic overstretch, where external conflict weakens internal resilience. At the same time, morale within Russia's security services deteriorated. Western experts cited interviews and leaked documents suggesting that many officers no longer viewed their roles as sustainable careers. Low pay, high risk, and diminishing legal protections pushed experienced personnel to resign or retire early. Those who remained were often younger, less trained, and operating within a culture increasingly shaped by wartime shortcuts rather than professional standards. The result was not only fewer officers on the streets, but a measurable decline in competence and accountability. For the Kremlin, this posed a dilemma. Restoring police capacity would require resources and political attention that conflicted with wartime priorities. Instead, the state leaned more heavily on symbolic displays of control and selective enforcement against political dissent, leaving ordinary crime to fester. Western observers warned that such prioritization often accelerates instability rather than containing it. Meanwhile, beneath Moscow's polished surface, these cracks continued to widen, setting the stage for a series of events that would soon expose how fragile Russia's internal security architecture had become. And what followed next shocked analysts watching from both inside and outside the country. How could a single training exercise expose an entire system's decay in a matter of seconds? In mid-January, deep in Russia's Komi Republic, what was supposed to be a routine police drill abruptly turned into a lethal disaster, sending shockwaves far beyond the walls of the training center. The explosion was not the result of enemy action or sabotage, but of decisions made inside the chain of command itself. For analysts, this was more than an accident. It was a compressed illustration of how wartime habits, bureaucratic indifference, and privilege had fused into a dangerous norm. What does it say about a security apparatus when safety rules are bent simply for comfort and no one dares to object? According to accounts, later corroborated by international media, the exercise was designed to train riot suppression and crowd control activities normally conducted outdoors. Instead, it was moved into a closed hall undergoing renovation, filled with flammable paint fumes because cold weather made outdoor training inconvenient. Inside that confined space were young cadets, some barely out of their teens, still unfamiliar with real operational risks. When a live grenade was deployed during the drill, the environment turned catastrophic almost instantly. The immediate consequences were devastating. Dozens were injured, and a young female officer lost her life, becoming a symbol of how recklessness at the top translates into irreversible loss at the bottom. Yet what followed was arguably even more revealing. There was no orderly evacuation. Instructors attempted to extinguish the fire themselves, worsening the blaze. Investigators later described a breakdown not only of protocol, but of basic responsibility. Western security specialists noted that such behavior is consistent with organizations where accountability has been hollowed out by years of impunity. As the investigation unfolded, the response of those involved highlighted another wartime distortion. One senior instructor placed under house arrest defended himself not through technical justification, but by emphasizing his status as a decorated veteran. This argument resonated deeply within Russia's current political climate, where military service increasingly functions as moral armor. Analysts from European think tanks observed that this phenomenon mirrors trends seen in other prolonged conflicts. Uniforms and medals become shields against scrutiny even when failures are clearly internal. The Komi incident also intersected with broader strategic pressures. At the same time, Ukraine was intensifying strikes against Russian energy infrastructure, targeting refineries, depots, and power distribution nodes. According to reporting from Reuters and Defense News, these attacks forced Moscow to redirect internal security units to guard critical facilities, further thinning police presence elsewhere. NATO officials described this as an unintended but effective secondary effect of Ukraine's campaign stretching Russian internal security beyond sustainable limits. The tragedy in Komi, therefore, did not exist in isolation. It emerged from a system under strain where training standards were lowered, oversight weakened, and wartime priorities distorted professional judgment. Western military analysts emphasized that such environments do not produce isolated failures. They generate patterns. When competence is sacrificed for speed and comfort, disasters become predictable rather than accidental. Yet the most alarming aspect was what this event signaled about the future. If police cadets could be placed in such danger during peacetime training, what protections remained for civilians relying on these same institutions? The Komi explosion was less a warning than a confirmation that decay had already set in. Meanwhile, as investigators focused on individual culpability, a far larger question loomed over Moscow if this was happening inside a controlled training facility. What was unfolding on the streets where oversight was even weaker? What followed next pushed that question into stark focus. When a state known for omnipresent policing suddenly lacks officers, what fills the silence left behind? By late 2025, the answer in Russia was becoming uncomfortably clear. The police state had not vanished in law, but it was evaporating in practice. According to data circulated by independent observers and echoed by Western media, the country was facing roughly 172,000 vacant police positions nationwide. This was not a statistical anomaly. It was a structural collapse unfolding in slow motion, and its consequences were already shaping daily life. What makes this figure so destabilizing is not only its size, but its pace. In just 3 years, the staffing gap had nearly doubled. Analysts compared the trend to a dam cracking under constant pressure, manageable at first, catastrophic once thresholds are crossed. Even Moscow, the political core of the regime, was not immune. In several districts, a majority of local officer posts stood empty, forcing remaining personnel to cover impossible workloads. Calls went unanswered, not because of negligence, but because no one was available to respond. Why were they leaving in such numbers? Western economic analysts point to a convergence of two forces, money and war. The Ukraine conflict reshaped Russia's labor market, creating massive incentives for military and defense industry employment, while hollowing out civilian security roles. A contract soldier deployed to the front could earn multiples of what a police officer made patrolling a neighborhood. Meanwhile, inflation eroded purchasing power, turning already modest police salaries into near-poverty wages. Faced with rising risks and shrinking rewards, resignation became a rational choice. The Kremlin's response revealed the depth of the crisis. Rather than restoring pay or conditions, authorities lowered recruitment standards. Physical fitness requirements were relaxed. Psychological screening was reduced. In some cases, background checks became perfunctory. Western policing experts warned that such measures rarely stabilize institutions. They accelerate dysfunction. When inexperienced or unsuitable recruits replace trained professionals, errors multiply and trust collapses. This erosion directly impacted public safety. Crime statistics released in 2025 showed a sharp rise in serious and violent offenses, reaching levels not seen in over a decade. Analysts from NATO-aligned research centers linked this spike to reduced patrol presence and investigative capacity. In effect, deterrence had weakened. Criminal groups, sensing the absence of authority, expanded operations with increasing boldness. At the strategic level, this internal breakdown intersected with external pressure. Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, widely reported by the BBC and Al Jazeera, forced Moscow to redeploy security units to guard refineries, pipelines, and power stations. Each reassignment further depleted street-level policing. Western strategists described this as a cascading effect, battlefield actions producing domestic insecurity without a single shot fired inside Russia's cities. Under President Donald Trump, the United States and its allies framed this dynamic as evidence that sustained pressure was forcing Russia into unsustainable trade-offs. Protect the front or protect the streets. Increasingly, Moscow chose the former. The result was a paradox, a state investing heavily in external security while losing control internally. Yet the most dangerous consequence was psychological. As citizens realized the police might not come, behavior changed. People stayed indoors, relied on informal networks, or armed themselves. Sociologists warned that such adaptations mark the early stages of social fragmentation. Meanwhile, as uniformed authority receded, a new set of actors began stepping into the vacuum, bringing with them experiences forged not in policing, but in war and prison yards. And what followed next would redefine the nature of crime across Russia. What happens when a war exports its violence back into society, stripped of discipline but armed with experience? By the time Russia entered the later stages of the Ukraine conflict, that question was no longer theoretical. It was walking the streets. As police numbers collapsed and oversight weakened, a new and volatile social force began to surface: former soldiers and released convicts returning from the front, carrying trauma weapons knowledge and a distorted sense of impunity. This dynamic was set in motion early in the war, when Moscow opened prison doors to replenish depleted manpower. Tens of thousands of inmates were offered a stark bargain fight for several months survive and earn freedom. Western analysts initially viewed the policy as a short-term expedient, yet its long-term implications were profound. Those who returned were not reintegrated through structured programs or monitored transitions. They were released into a society already strained by economic pressure and institutional decay. By 2025, crime data revealed the consequences. Serious and particularly serious offenses surged to their highest level in 15 years. Independent assessments cited hundreds of thousands of such crimes nationwide, with violent incidents disproportionately linked to individuals with military or penal backgrounds. Western criminologists emphasized that this pattern aligns with post-conflict environments, where combatants return without psychological support or economic stability. Adding to the danger was the emergence of new criminal formations. Informally dubbed hockey gangs by local observers, these groups were composed largely of former soldiers and ex-convicts. Unlike traditional organized crime, they operated with military-style coordination, rapid violence, and access to weapons smuggled from frontline zones. Reports from international outlets noted that Russian security services dismantled dozens of armed networks within months, an indicator not of success but of scale. Where did the weapons come from? The answer again pointed back to the war. Small arms, explosives, and ammunition leaked steadily from combat zones into civilian circulation. Western defense analysts warned that this phenomenon mirrored post-Second World War banditry waves, when demobilized fighters fueled criminal violence across Europe. In Russia's case, the effect was magnified by the absence of a robust policing response. The moral dimension of this crisis was equally corrosive. Some returnees carried state-awarded medals publicly celebrated as heroes while privately engaging in criminal activity. This blurred the line between valor and violence. Sociologists argued that such contradictions undermine the social contract, eroding trust not only in institutions, but in shared norms of right and wrong. At the geopolitical level, Western strategists observed that Ukraine's continued pressure on Russian infrastructure indirectly accelerated this internal breakdown. As energy facilities were struck and repaired, internal security forces were stretched thinner, leaving fewer resources to monitor returning fighters. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. officials framed this as an unintended but potent outcome of sustained strategic pressure. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect was how normalized this chaos became. For many Russians, violent crime was no longer shocking. It was expected. The state's monopoly on force, once absolute, now appeared fragmented among gangs, veterans, and opportunists. Meanwhile, as criminal violence intensified and policing faltered, a far more symbolic line was crossed when targets shifted from civilians to the very representatives of the state itself. And what followed next would shake the illusion of control at the heart of the capital. When violence reaches the capital, does it remain a crime problem, or does it become a political signal? In late 2025, Moscow crossed that threshold. The city that embodied centralized control began to resemble an arena where the state itself was being tested. Bombings, targeted killings, and brazen attacks no longer occurred on distant frontiers or neglected provinces. They unfolded in plain sight near government buildings and residential streets in Moscow. The message was unmistakable: the monopoly on violence was no longer secure. The most jarring moment came on a winter morning when a police vehicle was destroyed by an explosive device in southern Moscow, killing 2 officers. This was not random criminality. Analysts immediately identified the act as a challenge to authority, a declaration that even uniformed power could be hunted. Western security experts noted that such attacks typically mark a transition point, when criminal or insurgent actors test whether the state can still impose consequences. The Kremlin's response, tightened rhetoric without visible improvement in street security, only deepened doubts. Less than a day later, the shock intensified. A senior military figure was targeted in a separate bombing again in the capital. An improvised explosive device placed beneath a vehicle detonated with surgical precision, killing the general and exposing glaring gaps in protective protocols. Observers compared the method to techniques used in conflict zones, rather than domestic crime scenes. For a city saturated with cameras and security checkpoints, the attack raised an uncomfortable question: if generals were vulnerable, who was truly safe? The pattern did not stop there. Over the following months, multiple high-ranking figures met similar fates, ambushed near their homes, attacked during routine movements, or assassinated in public spaces. Each incident eroded the aura of invulnerability that the Russian state had cultivated for decades. Western intelligence assessments described the situation as a convergence of criminal violence and political instability, where motives blurred and deterrence collapsed. Strategically, these events intersected with external pressures. As Ukraine continued targeting Russian energy infrastructure, refineries, depots, and power nodes, security resources were pulled in conflicting directions. According to reporting by major Western outlets, internal units were reassigned to guard critical facilities, leaving fewer assets for personal protection of officials. NATO analysts characterized this as a textbook example of internal security dilution under sustained external strain. The psychological impact was immediate. Within the bureaucracy, fear replaced routine. Convoys changed routes, schedules became erratic, and protective details expanded, ironically consuming more manpower the state no longer had. Among civilians, the symbolism was even more corrosive. If the capital could not protect its own elites, confidence in everyday safety evaporated. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. officials publicly framed these developments as evidence that prolonged conflict was boomeranging inward, weakening Russia's internal coherence. European analysts echoed the assessment, warning that once elite security becomes reactive rather than preventative, instability accelerates. Yet the most disturbing signal came from imitation. Criminal groups began exploiting the chaos, donning fake uniforms and staging kidnappings, blurring reality and deception. Authority itself became a costume. Meanwhile, as Moscow's streets absorbed this new normal of fear and uncertainty, a deeper crisis emerged, not only of security, but of values and priorities. And what followed next forced observers to confront whether the system was decaying beyond repair. When a state stops protecting its citizens and focuses instead on protecting itself, what remains of the social contract? By early 2026, that question hovered over Russia's future with growing urgency. The erosion of policing, the surge in violent crime, and the assassinations in the capital were not isolated failures. Together, they pointed to a deeper moral and strategic collapse, one in which priorities had shifted away from public safety toward regime survival at any cost. Western analysts increasingly focused on the role of Russia's internal security services. The Federal Security Service, once portrayed as an omnipresent guardian, appeared to be operating under a radically narrowed mission. Rather than pursuing armed gangs, organized crime, or returning combatants, resources were concentrated on suppressing political dissent. Observers noted a stark contrast: a lone protester could be detained within minutes, while victims of violent crime sometimes waited hours or days for a response. This imbalance created what European security experts described as a structural blind spot, leaving society exposed to asymmetric threats. The consequences of this shift were illustrated by major security failures that reverberated internationally. Terrorist attacks and mass casualty incidents revealed delayed responses and coordination breakdowns, reinforcing the perception that the system was paralyzed. Analysts linked this paralysis to overstretch caused by the Ukraine war, where manpower funding and attention were consumed by external conflict. Continued Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure compounded the strain, forcing internal forces to guard pipelines and power plants instead of neighborhoods. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. and NATO officials interpreted these trends as evidence that sustained pressure was hollowing out Russia from within. Public statements emphasized that internal instability, not battlefield losses alone, posed the greatest long-term risk to Moscow's strategic position. European policymakers echoed the warning, noting historical precedents in which empires collapsed not from invasion, but from internal decay. For ordinary Russians, the impact was immediate and personal. Fear reshaped daily routines. Trust in institutions eroded. The implicit bargain taxes in exchange for protection appeared broken. Sociologists argued that once citizens internalize the belief that the state cannot or will not protect them, legitimacy dissolves rapidly. Yet the most troubling uncertainty lay ahead. Would the Kremlin respond with harsher repression, attempting to substitute force for stability? Or had the damage already gone too far? As 2026 unfolded, one reality was undeniable. The explosion in Komi, the empty police stations, and the violence in the capital were not anomalies. They were symptoms of a system consuming itself. And as history repeatedly shows, when internal decay reaches this stage, recovery becomes far harder than